Beneath the canopy of stars, the Earth no longer felt like a silent sphere adrift in space. It was alive, its voice faint at first, carried in the rustle of leaves, the sigh of the tide, the quiver of soil beneath bare feet. For those who listened closely, the planet had always spoken, but most no longer heard. Humanity had grown deaf to the whispers, wrapped in the hum of machines and the blinding glow of ambition. Only a few still paused long enough to notice the strain in the air, the dissonance creeping through the rhythms of life. Isla was one of them. She worked as a climatologist, her days consumed by data and models, her nights by dreams of oceans rising higher than cities. Each report she filed felt like a cry into the void. Her colleagues smiled politely, then returned to their pursuits of promotions, conferences, and incremental papers, as if the urgency could be shelved. Isla had begun to wonder if her warnings meant nothing, if numbers could move no one. Yet she could not look away. Each line on her graphs told her the same truth. Time was running out. Miles away, in the shadow of factories whose chimneys painted the horizon in gray, a boy named Kian grew up chasing shadows on walls instead of butterflies in fields. His world was narrowed by the choke of fumes, his sky often hidden behind clouds that did not bring rain, but only ash. He did not know the earth as Isla did, not through calculations or ancient knowledge, but through his lungs, which wheezed with each breath. For him, the planet was not a chart but a cage, its bars forged by choices made far above him. Kian was a child of consequence, living proof of costs others dismissed as distant. Their stories, though divided by distance and circumstance, shared the same center, a world unraveling. Where Isla felt the unraveling through intellect and Kian through body, the earth itself bore witness in silence, absorbing both the cries of warning and the coughs of the young. Each character was bound to the same central conflict, humanity's relentless pursuit of progress, blind to the fractures spreading beneath its own foundations. The planet was not their backdrop, it was their stage and their judge. In the old forests, the trees swayed with fewer companions each passing year, their trunks scarred where machines had bitten deep. Rivers that once ran with clarity now clutched silt and poison, their currents sluggish. To the untrained eye, these were small losses, almost invisible. But Isla knew they were signals, pieces of a message Earth was struggling to convey. In her solitude, she sometimes imagined the earth as an ancient presence straining to form words, gathering strength for a transmission no one wished to hear. Kian, though he had never spoken the language of science, understood the same truth in simpler ways. When his sister fell ill, her breath shallow and uneven, he wondered why air itself had become an enemy. He did not blame the trees or the rivers he had never seen. He blamed the world that had promised more and given less, the adults who turned away when smoke thickened, the leaders who spoke in slogans while neighborhoods withered. His pain was not abstract. It lived in the walls of his home, in the silence after his sister's coughing stopped for a few moments too long. Isla's path and Kian's path had not yet crossed, but both carried the seeds of what was coming. For Isla, the conflict was whether her voice could rise above the static, whether she could force humanity to listen before the earth itself shouted louder. For Kian, the conflict was survival, the daily struggle against a world that had already chosen winners and left him among the expendable. Both embodied the tension between awareness and neglect, between warning and consequence. And looming over them all was the presence no one could escape, the earth itself, gathering its final words. It had tolerated centuries of wounds, absorbed centuries of greed, but patience was not infinite. Every tremor in the ground, every storm tearing across the seas, every summer hotter than the last was the clearing of its throat. Soon it would no longer whisper. Soon the message would be clear, undeniable, and final. By the time Isla submitted her latest report, her fingers trembling on the keyboard, and Kian watched his sister's chest rise and fall with fragile rhythm, the story was already in motion. The transmission was forming. Though neither of them yet knew it, they were bound together, two voices on the edge of the same precipice. Earth was preparing to speak, and when it did, No one would be able to claim they had not been warned. The night fell quiet, the stars sharp above the horizon, as though the universe itself was waiting for the signal to begin. The world did not break all at once. It fractured in places, the cracks spreading quietly until the collapse could no longer be ignored. Isla watched it unfold from her office in the city's research center, where the hum of air conditioners competed with the weight of silence that followed every new report. Floods in the southern coasts, wildfires that devoured entire villages, droughts that hollowed out farmland. Each disaster became a headline, a statistic, a speech at a conference where leaders nodded gravely and promised change that never came. She carried these stories like stones, each one heavier than the last, pressing against her chest until breathing felt like defiance. Her own voice had begun to harden. Once she had spoken with cautious optimism, believing reason could still guide humanity back from the edge. Now her words were sharper, laced with urgency that unsettled her colleagues. Some avoided her, whispering about her intensity as though passion were a flaw. Yet Isla could not dilute her truth. She felt the earth's anger in the tremors of each storm, in the unease that lingered after a night of restless sleep. She knew the planet was not merely wounded, it was rising to defend itself. Far from the glass towers of the research center, Kian's world narrowed to survival. The factory district where he lived had become a furnace, its heat suffocating even at night. He spent his days scavenging clean water, standing in endless queues where arguments often broke into fists. His sister's illness had deepened. The sound of her breathing was a constant reminder of what the poisoned air was taking from them. Kian no longer dreamed of school or fields or freedom. His only dream was that she might survive another day. He had grown older than his years, his eyes carrying the weight of burdens that children were never meant to hold. The two of them, Isla and Kian, were still strangers to each other, yet the same current pulled them closer. Both lived beneath skies that seemed to sag with the pressure of what was coming. Isla's data and Kian's reality were not different stories, but two verses of the same song, a dirge composed by the earth itself. The conflict between humanity's ambition and its denial was no longer an abstract theme. It was the air they breathed, the silence they endured, the choices that had already bound their futures. One evening, Isla found herself unable to leave her office. She stared at the blinking cursor on her screen, her final recommendation to the government unfinished. The models were clear. Without drastic change, whole regions would become uninhabitable within decades, perhaps sooner. Yet she knew what would happen once she sent her report. It would be read, filed, debated, softened into language that promised progress without discomfort. She wanted to scream into the quiet room, to shatter the illusion that compromise could mend a wound so deep. For the first time, she wondered if speaking through reports was useless, if the only voice left to be heard was Earth's own. Meanwhile, in Kian's neighborhood, the night carried no relief. The factory fires burned late, staining the sky red. He sat beside his sister, listening to her fragile breaths. His mother prayed softly in the corner, her words colliding with the hum of machinery beyond their walls. Kian hated the prayers, not because he lacked faith, but because they felt like surrender. He wanted to fight, to break something, to demand the world return what it had stolen. Yet he was only a boy, and the weight of the world pressed down harder with each passing day. Both of them, in their separate spaces, felt the same truth. The conflict was no longer about preventing disaster. It was about surviving what was already unfolding. For Isla, the battle was against indifference, the suffocating inertia of people who refused to act. For Kian, the battle was against hunger, sickness, and the daily erosion of hope. The earth, watching in silence, had given them every warning, every chance, but humanity had chosen to look away. Now the consequences were arriving, relentless and unyielding. The city itself seemed to pulse with unease. Sirens wailed more often, not for accidents, but for floods that drowned streets and fires that leapt from one block to another. Food grew scarcer, prices higher, and tempers shorter. Rumors spread of riots in nearby districts, of families abandoning their homes in search of cleaner air. The illusion of stability was unraveling, thread by thread, and beneath it lay a truth no one wished to name aloud. The earth was reclaiming its due. On one of those nights, Isla stood on the rooftop of her building, the wind harsh against her face. From above, the city looked fragile, its towers like brittle teeth jutting from the earth. She closed her eyes and listened, not to the sirens or the shouts below, but to the deeper hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself. It felt like a heartbeat, slow and steady, ancient and implacable. For the first time, she wondered if the earth had already decided humanity's fate, if her work had always been less about saving the world and more about witnessing its final chapters. Kian, in another corner of the city, pressed his ear against the cracked wall of his home, listening to the distant rumble of thunder. It was not the gentle storm his mother once described in bedtime stories. This thunder was heavy, metallic, as though the sky itself were splitting apart. He did not fear it. In a strange way, it comforted him, a reminder that even in his smallness, he was connected to something vast and undeniable. He whispered to his sister, though she was asleep, that maybe the earth was speaking. Maybe it was angry. Maybe it would finally be heard. The night stretched long, taut with anticipation, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Neither Isla nor Kian could have known it, but they were both listening for the same thing, the first notes of a transmission that would soon reach every living ear. The transmission did not arrive as a sudden voice in the sky or a crackling broadcast across the airwaves. It began in the silence between breaths, in the moments when the world seemed to pause as if gathering strength. Storms grew louder, seas struck harder, fires burned hotter, yet what followed was not chaos but clarity. Earth spoke in the language of inevitability, its message rising from every fractured landscape, every poisoned current, every withered field. Those who listened could not deny what they heard. Humanity had sealed its fate. Isla stood in the control room of the research center when the blackout came. Screens flickered, servers died, and the city plunged into darkness. For a heartbeat, fear filled the room, voices tangled in panic, but then came the hum. Deep, resonant, not mechanical but elemental. It reverberated through the walls, through the bones of those present, through the ground itself. Isla pressed her palm against the table and felt it vibrating, steady, unrelenting. She understood instantly. This was not failure of technology. It was the earth itself, transmitting directly, stripping away the interference of wires and satellites. The message had found its channel. Across the city, Kian woke to the same sound. His sister stirred weakly, her lips moving though no words escaped. Their mother crossed herself and whispered prayers, but Kian did not fear. He felt the vibration in the floor, through his thin mattress, in the very air that filled his lungs. It was not a sound meant to frighten children. It was a sound meant to command attention, to pierce denial, to leave no refuge in silence. He placed his hand on his sister's chest, and in her fragile heartbeat he felt the same rhythm echoing. The message unfolded without words, yet its meaning was unmistakable. For centuries, the earth had endured humanity's hunger, its arrogance, its blind consumption. It had worn through tremors and droughts, through storms and rising seas. It had begged in the collapse of forests, in the dying songs of birds, in the vanishing of ice. But the warnings had been drowned in speeches, muffled in politics, buried beneath the noise of ambition. Now there was no space left for negotiation. The transmission was final. Humanity's fate was sealed not by the planet's cruelty, but by its own refusal to listen. Isla's chest tightened as she realized the enormity of what was happening. This was not an isolated event. The resonance would be felt across every continent, every settlement, every remaining refuge. She thought of the years she had spent calculating probabilities, projecting futures, writing reports that softened the truth. None of it mattered now. The truth was no longer hers to deliver. The earth had taken back its voice. She felt tears sting her eyes, not from fear but from the sheer gravity of being alive at the moment of reckoning. Kian rose to his feet, unsteady, as though the floor itself resisted his weight. Outside, the streetlights had gone dark, but neighbors gathered in doorways, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of lightning that split the horizon. None spoke. They listened, united by the same vibration that rolled through their chests, an unspoken declaration that they had all ignored too long. Kian felt both small and infinite, a single boy standing within the pulse of something vast. He looked at his sister, her fragile body trembling with each breath, and wondered if the earth would spare her. Deep inside, he knew mercy was not the message. Justice was. The city's skyline flickered under the storm, its glass towers trembling. Sirens wailed, and then fell silent as power grids collapsed. Yet amidst the unraveling, there was no confusion. Every person understood. The Earth was not asking for change. It was announcing the verdict. The planet would endure, with or without those who had wounded it. Humanity, for all its brilliance and arrogance, had become a temporary guest who overstayed its welcome. Isla closed her eyes and let the transmission move through her. She thought of Kian without knowing his name, of countless children across the world who bore the scars of choices they had never made. She thought of the forests she had walked as a child, the seas that had once been blue, the skies untainted by smoke. She wondered if Earth grieved for what it was losing, or if grief was only a human conceit. The vibration grew stronger, shaking the glass in the windows until fractures spidered across their surfaces. She whispered into the darkness, not to her colleagues, not even to herself, but to the earth. "We heard you too late." Kian pressed his forehead to the wall of his home, the cool plaster trembling beneath his skin. For a moment, he felt connected not just to the earth, but to every person listening across oceans and borders. Kings and beggars, scientists and children, all shared the same revelation. The story was ending, and they were the authors of its conclusion. His mother clutched his sister tighter, murmuring prayers that dissolved into sobs. Kian did not cry. He simply listened, committing every note of the earth's voice to memory. The hum deepened, then steadied, becoming almost unbearable in its constancy. And then, in the stillness after the final reverberation, words formed, not in sound but in thought, carried directly into the marrow of every listener. The words were simple, undeniable, and final. "You have sealed your fate." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. Isla felt it press against her chest, a silence that was not emptiness, but closure. Kian felt it too, the absence of the hum leaving a hollow that no prayer could fill. Across the planet, humanity held its breath, but the earth had already spoken. The transmission was complete. Above the city, the storm began to scatter, stars piercing through the torn clouds. The earth did not vanish into vengeance. It settled into stillness, as though relieved to have spoken at last. What came next would not be swift annihilation, but the slow unraveling already underway. Recovery for the planet, decline for the species that had ignored its voice. Isla lowered her head, her body trembling with exhaustion, but in her heart she carried the weight of finality. She no longer thought of reports or conferences. She thought only of the echo of the earth's words, of the certainty that her kind had crossed the last threshold. Kian lay down beside his sister, his eyes open to the crack in the ceiling above. He felt neither hope nor despair, only the strange calm of knowing that truth had finally been spoken aloud. The night closed in, and the earth's final transmission lingered like a shadow over every soul who had heard it. Humanity was no longer in dialogue with the planet. The conversation had ended. The verdict was sealed.